Democracy in collaboration with the Global Governance Centre and the Department of International History at the Graduate Institute. My name is Maria Mexi, and I will be moderating this panel discussion on the Western Balkans, addressing issues of local priorities and fractured regional perspectives. Before we to our event, I would like to say that our discussion will be recorded, and all of you watching us, you can send us your questions throughout the session. Actually, we encourage you to send us your questions. Let me now bring in our panelists. I'm very delighted to be joined today by Yasmin Hasic, National Director of Humanity in Action, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Assistant Professor at the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. Velibor Jakovlevski, Head of Research at the Global Governance Centre at the Graduate Institute and one of our co-organizers today. With us, we have also Jovana Mihailovic-Sterbovic, Research Fellow at the Research Centre of the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts and at the Institute of Culture and Memory Studies in Ljubljana. Also, we are very honored to be joined by Ivan Vejvoda, Permanent Fellow at the Institute for Human Science in Vienna. And last but not least, with us we have Adam Bolas, Visiting Fellow at the International History Department of the Graduate Institute, and one of the two editors of a new, very interesting book titled The Visegrad Four and the Western Balkans. So welcome all. Before I give the floor over to Velibor, I will go quite quickly to Adam, who will help us set the scene of our discussion today. So Adam, as we know historically, and it's also a key theme in your book, in the Western Balkans, but also in the Visegrad region, questions of identity, mobility, and democracy have been very closely interlinked with issues of borders, border sharing, and border divisions. And where are we today, and where are we heading?
Thank you, Maria. Welcome or welcome back, given that this is the second round of a double event. Let me also thank, like Maria, the Hirschman Centre, the Global Governance Centre, and the Department of International History for organizing and hosting these events. We are very grateful for that. And let me thank the participants for having accepted the invitation. It's really great to have all of you together in a panel today. So let me make just two short introductory comments on how this regional inquiry that we started 2 weeks ago connects to European questions, aware of the fact that the regional scale of things is not one bit less European than the continental scale of things. First comment. The EU enlargement process plays a key role in how and why these regions are delineated. So the primary raison d'être of the Visegrad Group was to join forces to join the European community as quickly as possible. Now, regarding the Western Balkans, the very name is a bit pejorative and at the same time a bit hypocrite, a name for those countries that haven't joined the EU yet. So my point is that there is certainly much more to the regional scale of things than a classification following one single process, the EU enlargement. And the reason why it's really great to have you today is because you represent the diversity and also the potential of a region often hidden or perhaps lost behind labels and stigma. So this first question of mine is that what we did in the book was basically harsh criticism and deconstruction of national identities. But isn't such criticism and deconstruction aimed at pointing toward more positive aspects? So this should be constructive, and I propose to put a bit some emphasis on the positive side of things behind the negative labels today. Second point. In the Western Balkans, the EU enlargement process has reached a point of exhaustion. And as a matter of fact, the negative example of some Visegrad countries, namely Poland and Hungary, these negative examples do play a role in this exhaustion. So concerning the link and the border between the two regions, there is no clear-cut fixed border between the Western Balkans and the Visegrad Group. So there are longer-term ties and longer-term legacies, particularly imperial legacy, but there is certainly much more than this classification following the enlargement process. So I would say, and this is a European issue, that between the Western Balkans and the Visegrad Group, there is a European question mark. And this European question mark is about what happens when we have joined the EU. Once that we are the EU, what are the new political perspectives? So this is the question mark between a region trying to join the EU and a region where some countries do not play according to the rules of cohesion. So my 2 points were about basically what's next. And this was the huge question mark at the end of the book, which I consider as a first step towards something. And now I leave the floor to Velibor to reflect on that, among other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam and Maria, Laura, everybody for helping put this event together, for all the panelists for being here. On behalf of the Global Governance Center, we're happy to collaborate here with our colleagues at the Institute. A lot of important questions raised in the book and also in the previous webinar. And obviously, I mean, this is not obviously, but to me it's obvious. It's an issue close to home for me, given my first name and last name. So I'd like to share a couple of thoughts here, but I'm going to leave them more or less on the macro level, and I'm going to leave the more sort of difficult and nuanced questions about identity politics to the other experts on the panel. So I have sort of two main objectives that I want to bring forward here. So one is to sort of be a bridge between the first webinar and to connect the Visegrad 4 and the Western Balkan experiences. And the second is to sort of situate these questions of identity, mobility, and democracy within the Western Balkan region, but also within the broader relationship with the EU, the broader institutional framework. So the 3 points that I want to raise specifically, the first one is to show how the path of the Visegrad 4 and the Western Balkans is intimately tied, and this could be seen as for better or for worse type of situation. I want to address very briefly what sort of motivates change, as the abstract for this event suggests, and then to propose what the EU neighborhood policy does, and when it can have these sort of counterintuitive outcomes. And then I'm just going to briefly wrap things up. So to begin, I think it's important to frame the relationship between the EU and its neighborhood. So first, I think it's important to remember that there's an idea here that the EU is on a quest for order and a quest for regional stability, and enlargement is a big component of this. The other component is integration, the internal component. So there are the internal and the external dimensions. They are intertwined, and I'm going to try to come back to that at the end. The second point is that the EU, through this process of engaging its neighborhood, it's also on a quest for identity. This means the EU's own identity, but also the identity of the neighboring states themselves. And I think the examples of the Visegrad states and the Western Balkan states demonstrate this. So to rewind a little bit, to go back to when it sort of all began formally, at least engaging with the EU. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Central and Eastern European states, the V4 among them, obviously, they were very eager to show their European credentials, and they wanted to return to Europe in a sense. But their integration only really took off because of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. That was sort of the existential crisis that served as a catalyst. They were on their way, but it served as a catalyst. So that's why it's the sort of for better or for worse scenario that I outlined. And I think that this crisis, this regional crisis, European crisis, clarified two priorities for the EU. First, that the Central and Eastern European states, they needed to be integrated fully into the EU. And the second is that the spillover from the Yugoslav wars had to be avoided. And the EU wasn't really ambiguous about this at all. There was a strict distinction between who would be an insider and who would be an outsider. So in a sense, then the inclusion of the V4 states and the exclusion of the Western Balkan states, they were sort of opposite sides of the same coin. And this experience shaped the EU-Western Balkan relationships thereafter. The EU learned a lot from the first round of enlargement to Eastern and Central Europe. And it was also encouraged, there was a sense of optimism, I think, during that time in the EU. And it was encouraged towards the Western Balkans as well. So in this sense, they're not, as Adam said, they're not intimately tied, maybe these two regions, but I would argue that the Western Balkans are sort of in the institutional shadow, if we can say, of the Visegrad Group. Still, though, for the Western Balkans to really expedite their path to Europe, there needed to be another, unfortunately, another existential crisis, and this was the Kosovo War in this case. And this was a bit of a turning point also for EU neighborhood policy. I think this is where it started to be more proactive and it started to be more flexible. So these clear-cut distinctions of insiders and outsiders were increasingly becoming blurred. And then some commentators would even lead to call the EU a sort of a neo-medieval empire in this sense, because they would have these sort of overlapping, fading lines of authority as one moved away from Brussels and more towards the neighborhood. And I think these lines still remain blurred today to some extent. And this leads to my second point. And my second point is about what motivates change in the EU's neighborhood. Or in other words, how does Europeanization actually come about? And this can be boiled down to sort of three main models. And just very briefly, one is the so-called external incentives model. So this is this idea of membership conditionality, which leads to the EU declaring that enlargement is its most successful foreign policy tool. Basically, non-members must apply EU rules, standards. This is very costly domestically, obviously. And then they need to be rewarded with joining the EU. The second is a more social learning model, and this basically means that non-members want or share the same values that the EU does, and the short-term pain of reforms in this case is worth the price because they have their own value in itself, these common values. And the third is the sort of more lesson-drawing model, and this is basically where the EU is more passive and these countries are more active, and they seek out best practices and so on to approximate to the EU. So these are the sort of main three models that have been identified in the literature. And the question is, why are these distinctions important? Well, on one hand, they're probably not that important because I would argue that they each exist at different stages or at different segments of society. But for our purposes today, I think it does matter because I think each one has different implications for the role that identity politics play. So in one, they can be more of a primary concern, and another, they can be secondary. I think it's also important to note that the general consensus seems to be that this external incentives model really is the main motivator for reform in the EU's neighborhood. Specifically, I would argue also as well in the Western Balkans. And this is based on a very important bargain. So effectively, you pay the membership price and then you join the club. And this is where the EU can get into some trouble, which is going to lead me to my third point, because when the reward for membership is not offered despite fulfilling conditions, it can be obviously problematic, or where a member or a non-member essentially backslides, as Adam alluded to, but they don't really get punished. So bringing it to my third point then, I think the EU's relationship with the Western Balkans has more recently and probably will continue to result in some perverse incentives and counterintuitive outcomes. So EU enlargement policy is effectively intergovernmental, and member states decide who joins the club. And they do this democratically, they decide by consensus. So as a result, we can have a situation like North Macedonia and Bulgaria today. Basically, you have a member and a non-member, and they're playing out their identity politics in the shadow of EU enlargement policy. So in effect now, what Macedonia, or North Macedonia, I should say, it has to decide whether to reevaluate its language and national identity to get the reward of eventual EU membership. So this is a very tough sell domestically. And it might be easier if the memberships, the benefits of membership, I should say, are more tangible. And this isn't the only example, and probably not even the toughest example when it comes to bilateral issues in the Balkans. So one example, another one is Kosovo and Serbia. So Serbia had contemplated recognizing Kosovo. It entertained disregarding old claims towards Bosnia-Herzegovina. When this dialogue was around a few years ago, the price seemed to be worth it at that time. Now maybe not so much, for Serbia at least. So I don't want to overstate these bilateral issues. They do exist. Many are probably more technical than they are identity-based. But I think it's worth noting that also EU members themselves are wary of enlargement, specifically today, again, as Adam mentioned. And mainly because they really can't sell it domestically, at least not at the moment. So there are probably some member states that are pleased to see actually a country like Bulgaria vetoing Macedonia, because that means that they don't have to, because again, they're lukewarm at best on enlargement. So in other words, then identity politics within the EU, it can and it has shaped policy and identity politics outside the EU. On the one hand, enlargement is meant to foster common European goals and values. But on the other hand, it can help undermine them under certain conditions, as I tried to explain. So in this sense, the EU's own institutional apparatus can become a vector for identity politics. So to conclude, I want to bring back a few points. So the first more general point is that I think institutions and institutions that shape the EU's relationship with its neighborhood, these institutions are what we make of them, what politicians, what society makes of them. I think this is especially important when different institutions or identities are in conflict. Institutions that bind the EU and its neighbors, they can be amplifiers of domestic politics. This is the case both within the EU and beyond it as well. Maybe you can argue if enlargement was a less democratic policy within the EU, so basically if the Commission decided whether or not the EU enlarges, then identity politics outside might be alleviated. Then of course it might be worse within the EU. The second point is that identity can be negotiated. In fact, it has been negotiated. A cynic might say that this is what EU enlargement policy is all about. And the third point is that negotiations are about leverage and effectively following through at the end. Tough compromises have to be made to become European, quote unquote. We can maybe discuss what that actually means. And it's not just on these compromises aren't just on domestic issues, domestic reform, institutional reform, but also sometimes on national identity. And for this to happen, effectively, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. So far, I don't think the EU has shown that it will be worth it. At the same time, Western Balkan countries also need to demonstrate an unwavering interest in EU enlargement. That has not happened, or at least it's not happening right now. And I think both of these elements are important to moderate sort of nationalist sentiments bubbling up, both inside the EU and outside. If this doesn't happen, if this isn't the case, then there could be other viable alternatives for the region. China and Russia, they pop their head in from time to time now a little bit more systematically. And they could, and to some extent, have already provided their own external incentives model to the Balkans. So to wrap things up, to come back to this idea of the EU's quest for order and identity, like I said, it has an internal dimension and an external dimension inherently tied. And I think it's important to keep in mind that while the EU remains preoccupied with its own house, I think identity and influence outside of the EU can be up for grabs. So I'll wrap it up there, and then I'm looking forward to continuing the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a question. Okay, you mentioned the bilateral issues. In a few words, do the Western Balkans and the EU share a future?
I mean, yes, they share a future. What that future looks like, I don't know, but they are definitely going to be, their fate is intertwined for better or for worse, to fall back to that easy escape for a very tough question. But again, maybe we can come back to that in more detail later.
Thank you very much. Let us now go to Jovana, who will be speaking about the experience of Slovenia, right? How issues of identity, memory, and grassroots activism there resonate with the current trajectory of the Western Balkans. So, Ioana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, my intention was not really to speak about Slovenia, but from the position of Slovenia. And I'm going to explain why this position is interesting for critically thinking about the concepts and the way the politics is organized, as Velibor presented very nicely from top-down level. My view is going to be a bit bottom-up. So just to give a short intro, I'm originally coming from Serbia and am working as a researcher in Slovenia. Therefore, this also put me in a different position of observing the specific positionality of Slovenia that I mentioned. On one hand, Slovenia became a member, the EU member, in 2004 with other Central and Eastern European countries. And in many ways, Slovenia likes to organize its own identity politics in this way as being belonging to Central Europe and distancing itself very often as much as possible from the Western Balkans and any association with the Yugoslav wars and the Balkans as such. However, on the other hand, what we see in the foreign policy and in the identity politics of Slovenia is that from time to time, Slovenian official politics tend to use its specific position of being part of former Yugoslavia and presenting itself as an expert on the region, taking part in decision-making bodies in European Parliament, in European Commission, and in, for instance, in European representation in Kosovo. Here we see that already, you know, the image of identity politics as something coherent, as something predefined, is already cracking because it's actually much more malleable and prone to being used opportunistically from time to time as the politics on European level shift and change. However, if we look at the political sphere from the position of an ordinary citizen, especially from a position of a citizen on a social margin, we can see that all these narrative about a region having clear-cut borders and being able to put countries in particular regions and states having, you know, clear regional politics is actually not really not looking so coherent and doesn't look so clear-cut. It's much more messy looking from below. Why? Because actually, and I'm here going to pinpoint to the word in our seminar topic, and that is mobility. Mobility is not only something that is coordinated and organized by the intentions of states, and this mobility should be understood much more than just mobility of people moving from one place to another, but there is also mobility of ideas, cultural concepts, networks and associations of the people who have who are actually at the same time belonging to different regions and different regions and cultural spheres. So in that way, we could say that in many respects, Slovenia and Slovenian citizens are belonging to Central and Eastern Europe. Their lives are defined by the fact that they live within Schengen area. However, in many ways, for many people living in Slovenia or living occasionally in Slovenia or moving in and out from Slovenia and back to other countries, you can see that actually people at the same time, one person may belong to Slovenia and belong to a political community of the European Union, but at the same time, they're if we look at their cultural preferences, the way they get information, which media outlets they are following, they are actually belonging to something called Yugosphere, which is used for cultural sphere of former Yugoslavia. Then depending on your legal status, whether you're a citizen or temporary resident, whether you what kind of people you are interacting, whether you are involved in migrant communities or have contact with them, your positionality is changing. And in this way, also, we could say that Western Balkans does still exist, even though it is a bit maybe obsolete term and used only in the context of European integration. When we look at the migration crisis and NGO networks connected with migration, protection of human rights, we can in many ways see that Western Balkans does exist as this liminal region that is not yet or will never be under the auspice of, you know, all of the European regulations, but are very much indirectly defined by them. So I wanted to also, so not only to criticize that this, you know, that this top-down vision is not meaningful, but I'm just adding that we should look at the different types of engagement with politics that is happening on grassroots level, and that is happening cross-border, and that is redefining the whole concept of a political or a geographic region that we are discussing now today. So I'm going to give a few examples of the transnational, over-border or cross-border activism and share of ideas, knowledge, experience, and practices. So in an interesting book that came out in 2011 and was edited by Florian Bieber and Dario Brentin, it's called Social Movements in the Balkans, Rebellion and Protest from Maribor to Taksim. And I like this, from Maribor, so at the north of Slovenia, to Taksim in Istanbul. And it's describing, among other things, not only the wave of civic protest that started in Maribor in 2012 and then moved to protests that were called the YMBG that started in Sarajevo and then spread out throughout Bosnia. But what is specific about this activism is that it's redefining concept of citizenship in the way that Ergin Isin said that the new activist citizenship is emerging, which is not defined by belonging to one state and having a citizenship, but it's basically citizenship in deeper political sense. And it's also redefining the realm of politics, bringing new agents, new sites of political clash into the topic. Into the topic or into the realm of political. And here we can see that social networks and internet also played an important role, and these grassroots networks of activists who were connected on different types of topic, from dealing with the past, anti-nationalism, protection of human rights, support of migrants on the Balkan route, and many other topics, including gender equality and feminism. What we are seeing these days, for instance, is a small wave of Me Too movement that started in Belgrade and then moved to Sarajevo and then to Zagreb, and now is happening in Ljubljana. And it's not really a movement because these people generally don't know each other, but there is a mobility of, not a mobility, but there is a share of ideas and influences where certain political discussions in Belgrade just spill over into Zagreb without really official politics having anything to do with it, but simply people, you know, following social media, reading news from the region, and thinking through on the basis also of the common cultural and historical experiences. So to finish with the last example of this regional spillover of ideas and activism, it's also so-called memory activism, and that is activism on grassroots level of different individuals and groups who are engaging in memory and remembrance of different points related to Yugoslav wars, let's say, or the common Yugoslav past. But they are intentionally redefining it outside of the official memory politics that are pretty much serving agenda of reifying dominant nation and presenting it as a closed community of people who live and breathe in unison. The memory activists are sharing not only knowledge about what happened in Yugoslavia to the other communities, the people on the other side, but they are also sharing empathy, and they are learning from each other how to do this kind of activism and to, in a way, break the dominance of the official identity politics. And here I would end for now. Thank you.
Very much. Yasmin, you're heading an NGO in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? Is that correct? So, what role for civil society organizations there? How can we create more space for democracy?
Okay, thank you so much. I was first of all very thankful for being invited to this panel, and though I'm a very firm believer in ethnic time, I was warned several times that 10 minutes in Switzerland is 10 minutes and not 12 minutes and not minutes. So I'm going to literally stick to this and skip all the pleasantries I would otherwise engage in and just jump into the topic. So
the Swiss panel, though. It's not a Swiss panel.
It is Swiss American panel. So 10 minutes is 10 minutes. Obviously a joke, but in my intervention, obviously I'm going to focus on Bosnia because this is the case that I know the best, and I think it's one of the cases that can best illustrate, not only that I know it the best, but the one that can best illustrate what is happening in the region, because it's within all of the mess that is going around in the region, one of the messiest one, but still has some beauty in it, at least from an academic point of view. So yes, I'm running a small NGO, and we do all sorts of things, primarily focusing on peace building and youth, but also on memory as a component of peace building, and also how social mobilizations among youth sort of work in different areas, both domestically, regionally, and transnationally, to foster the entire process of post-conflict re-dynamization and recalibration to what it's supposed to be like in an ideal world. At the very beginning, I wanted to sort of outline 3 basic normative assumptions that I would like to focus on, and then maybe 2 consequences where I see how memory and identity play certain specific roles, academically at least, in how Bosnian young people and old people and everybody in Bosnia position themselves towards their own future, both domestically, but they're also towards their own future in the European Union. So first of all, the first normative assumption that I think I agree on, that is that memory still matters in Bosnia. It is something that drives social sort of movements. It is something that divides people. It is something that connects people within the same ethnic groups or communities of memory. It is something that absolutely gets you votes if you're running for votes. It is something that prevents you from marrying somebody else from another ethnic group if the in your brain and in your local community of memory is so strong to prevent you from jumping into another category. It is something that sparks violent outbursts at sports events, in the streets and so on. So memory matters. Let's put it this way. The second sort of normative assumption would be that memory compartmentalizes itself in at least three, but even more categories. So when you look at Bosnia, there are at least 3 communities of memory, at least I'm saying, because there are dozens and dozens of more of these that are intertwined between different factors that we don't pay attention to. One of the most prominent sort of examples of this is that everybody thinks that there is a Bosniak memory of the war, Croat memory of the war, Serb memory of the war, but very often people forget the memory of others, or the memory of minority groups, the memory of gendered sort of specific categories in the country or social groups, or even within the sort of main stream ABC memories, there's even sort of within the Bosniak community different memories that shape minority groups within the Bosniaks who have different perceptions of what happened in their region as opposed to what happened in Sarajevo or in Tuzla and so on and so forth. The most prominent example would be Cazinska Krajina region. And the third sort of normative assumption would be that memory, compartmentalized as it is, still produces certain responses which are different among the 3 at least groups and all the other communities of memory, which is sometimes sort of cooperative. So memory can bring people closer. Memory can surpass the ethnic, daily, vigilante, sort of conflictual narratives that are happening in the private or media space or in the public. But also it can produce a lot of violence, a lot of interest-based calculations, a lot of different issues that people don't pay attention to because they're so strictly embedded in what they want to do and how they want to remember the recent war and the legacies that affected them personally or their communities or their families, as opposed to not thinking about the consequences that somebody else has suffered through. So in the 3 main assumptions, so memory matters, there are more types present, and each type produces different responses. So the 3 assumptions tell us that collectivized memory in Bosnia has not been institutionalized yet. And this is one of the biggies. Because if it was institutionalized, I mean, don't get me wrong, it was institutionalized as the lowest common denominator. So there's a cantonal memory, there's an entity memory, there's an institutional memory within certain institutions that foster memory. But there is no sort of national framework of I'm not advocating for one singular universal memory to be followed, but sort of common denominator of respecting each other's memory and sort of abiding to the normal principle of behavior that genocide is bad for everybody. Everybody's genocide is bad. Or everybody's suffering matters. Everybody's sort of community played a role in doing X, Y, Z, sort of this kind of memory. And because of it, the country as right now, described as weak, as failed, as frozen conflict, as all the negative things you read in all of the books describing Bosnia as a post-conflict sort of experiment, will tell you that Bosnia and Herzegovina as a country was unable to promote its, for instance, foreign policy in a way that should sort of ascribe the country as a reconciliation success, as a peace-building success, as a success that followed certain steps that were successful, but still there are many other things to resolve. This lack of sort of national level institutionalization had at least 2 consequences, which are the central point that I want to make in this intervention of mine. First point is that because the country and sort of smaller sub-national units in the country were unable to galvanize, to digest the memory in the right way, to sort of find the common denominators, there are sort of non-governmental organizations such as Mothers of Srebrenica as the most prominent case, who have stepped in and sort of claimed the space that the country as an institutionalized sort of political system should have established on its own. So, for instance, if you take, and this is the part of NGOs coming to the forefront of the fight. So, Mothers in Srebrenica, as a let me put it very plainly, without trying to offend anybody or anything, doing anything in a negative context, are a group of victims, mothers who have lost their children during the 1995 happenings. Let's call them happenings in Srebrenica. I would describe them as genocide, as per the verdicts of the ICTY and ICJ. Some would say there's a massacre. In any case, a grave crime that happened in Srebrenica. And they're not educated. They have no institutional support per se in organizing their commonalities and communities of remembering, and yet they have become a global brand, a change maker in Bosnia, to say. They have been able to establish not only the community of memory, but they also have been testifying in various judicial sort of institutions advocating for truth-seeking sort of advocacy that they have promoted. Second form is that they embedded local sort of grief and local victimhood into a global notion of what victimhood could become in everybody else's context. So the advocacy, never again, remembering Srebrenica, there is a flower, there is a commemoration, there is a July 11th, Ban Ki-moon comes over, presidents of different countries join to sort of commemorate what they nationally, in their own national narratives, are disputing, not as personalities, but their own national narratives within the institutions. And the third part, perhaps most visible one, is their advocacy through social movements. Meaning where Handke was awarded Nobel Prize for his literary achievements, they have staged different protests in Sarajevo, in Stockholm, in The Hague, and so on and so forth, to not only commemorate what they believe is important, but also to sort of condemn what they believe should not be rewarded or sort of praised by anybody, let alone the Nobel Committee, sort of giving awards to somebody who denies genocide, not only in Bosnia, but everywhere else in the world for that matter. So this is one of the consequences of this poorly staged institutionalized memory. The other one was something probably more related to what Velibor was saying, is the EU path of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is illustrated through this fatigue that I mean everybody's aware of, but also this conditionality, pressure, reward giving, sort of taking back sticks and carrots and everything else that is going on. So when you take, I'm going to take only 1 minute to explain this and then open the floor for your questions, obviously. If you take a look at the recent, sort of not recent, but recently developed migration management crisis in Bosnia, which is going on for the last 3 years, maybe a little bit longer, but much less than in Macedonia or in Serbia. You can see how European Union, instead of conditionality that it usually applies to Bosnia and Herzegovina, has engaged in what I call pseudo-conditionality. What it means. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a weak state which poorly sort of defined institutional capacities to handle international crisis. I mean, we cannot handle our own domestic crisis very well. So international crisis such as migration crisis is something that needs management, which is sort of facilitated not only from the country, but also from the outside. So when the EU is talking to Bosnia about the migration crisis, EU uses its own positionality as a condition for the EU accession process to also foster some of the processes that are not specifically related to the enlargement process itself. Migration management, international migration management happening in Bosnia is not part of Copenhagen or Madrid or any other process. And Bosnia should never, in any circumstance, take any lead from the European Union in what to do and how to manage the crisis. How does the relationship in the enlargement process exists as such, we are pseudo-conditioned to believe that the EU has to say something about it to us. And the way they do it, the way they offer money, the way they offer assistance, sort of feels that our migration management process is part of the enlargement, And in fact, it's not. But because we are so conditioned to believe so, and the institutions are weak and unable to process their own sort of strength to resist such processes, we are giving in to this narrative of EU offering us money, us managing the process, and things going in the bad direction as they are. So these are at least 2 points sort of that I believe that memory has, or mobility, or sort of this galvanizing processes in the last 25 years have produced. And I'm super happy sort of to elaborate this more in the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will go directly to Eva now because of reasons of time efficiency, actually. Eva, you have an immense experience in the region. You were a key figure in the democratic opposition movement in Yugoslavia. And now you are heading a big project on the future of Europe. Tell us a bit about your experience, and also what I asked Velibor, how does the future of the Western Balkans resonate with the future of the EU?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, Adam and Laura. And it's a real honor to be with Velibor, Jovana, and with Yasmin. Really great presentations from all of you from different aspects. And, you know, my simple answer is the futures are completely intertwined. I mean, Velibor said it in not so many words. You know, we are what I've been calling this region, the inner courtyard of Europe. You know, to Yasmin's point about migration, you know, there's a lot of hypocrisy. The migrants come from a European NATO member state called Greece, or Turkey, NATO member state. They come through our region and they go into another EU member state. We're kind of a pass-through. And so, you know, let's not pretend here. Everybody's kind of blaming the other. And I don't know whether I mentioned it in our prep talk, but the Western Balkans, for all intents and purposes, are members of the European Union when the migration crisis is concerned. They had to be at the table in Brussels and Berlin in 2014 to resolve the issue of the Balkan route. They were, you know, not begged, but they were invited. They had to sit there. And, you know, Berlin, Brussels, and Paris had to ask them how to do it. I remember Macedonia was very proactive, and they introduced a joint identification piece for the migrants that were coming in from Greece. That was then used in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, wherever they went through. So very cooperative. And I, you know, was so surprised one day waking up that the BBC had this very positive reportage on Serbia. I said, you know, am I hearing correctly here? Because Serbia was dealing very well. Why? Well, because of the sad history that we have experienced with migrants. You know, when 200 Serbs came in a week's time from Croatia in '95, we were all mobilized, bottom up. Again, Jovana's very important point. There's so much that was happening. It was B92 and Veran Matic who organized food for these people. We went out to do them. So imagine 200,000 people in a week's time. Whereas here it was 1 million during, you know, I don't know how long. So the experiences are very different. In addition, Serbia has, whatever you want to call it, a Muslim Bosniak population. I went to school with a lot of, you know, people, even though we didn't know at that time who we were. Blood cells started being counted when the war began. Horrible. Slavenka Drakulic wrote about it so eloquently. But let me say from the outset, because, you know, I wanted to and I did deal with political theory and political philosophy, and Adam prompted us to focus on democracy as well as some of you have. You know, I always remember Istvan Bibo's definition, one of his thoughts on democracy. Democracy is the absence of fear. And I think for me, that was so revealing in so many ways, a very simple idea. Why do I say that? Because everything that has happened to us in former Yugoslavia and in other post-communist countries has to do with the absence of democracy. We did not have democracy. Yes, Yugoslavia was soft totalitarianism. You know, we could buy the Financial Times. I always traveled westwards, never eastwards until 1990. And all the cliches about the attractiveness of the Yugoslav passport. But there was no democracy, and so it was revealed unto us that even this soft communist regime was a communist regime. The backbone was totalitarian. There was a monopoly of political power in the party. You couldn't talk about politics, and as one journalist said, you know, you can't say you're left-leaning or right-leaning. You can say you're a Serb or you're a Croat, and so that was politics. The second thought on democracy comes from Norberto Bobbio, who, in a speech that he gave in Turin, I believe, when asked, you know, what is kind of the forte, what is a good governance, what is a good government, what is democracy, I would say, and he said very simply, it is avoiding the extremes of suffering. Avoiding the extremes of, so what happened in our country? All these guys went for the extremes of suffering. And that is something, as usually happens in history, something that shouldn't have happened at the end of the 20th century happened. In the middle of Europe, we had war, even though we in my generations and those after were told never again. We were taken to the concentration campsites, we were shown the movies, we talked to survivors in school, and yet we went down the hellhole because of the fact that we didn't have democracy. Let me simplify it at best. Even though there were attempts to, you know, the various parties that tried to bridge over the differences that we had, you know, it was sort of intellectual elites from Ljubljana to Skopje. We were meeting, discussing, saying, how do you avoid this? You know, we brought people like Adam Michnik to Belgrade and Bronislav Geremek to talk. In 1991, Milo Angelas was still alive. You know, how do we avoid war? There was a peace caravan that my friend Sonja Licht organized through Bosnia, through in those early years, to no avail, because the substratum of the system was communist. It was an atomized society. Let me just give you one particular anecdote referring to this issue of identity. I went to teach at Sussex University in '93, and my very good friend from Bosnia, Vesna Bojčić, who still teaches there, who was a lecturer in Mostar and was kicked out by her colleague Croats there as the war began. She told me that coming into Britain, they had to fill out a formulaire, and it said, you know, declare yourself Serb, Croat, Bosniak, and it said in the footnote, you cannot say Yugoslav. So apropos of constructions of identity, the Brits in '92, when she came from Mostar, you couldn't say Yugoslav. So this whole destruction has a lot to do with also of issues of self-definition. I define myself as Yugoslav because I come from an extremely mixed family background. When people ask me, what are you now? I say Serb because I have a Serbian passport. You know, who has time to explain the intricacies of our family and cultural histories? I think an important book and work is the one by Igor Štix and Joe Shaw, their book on citizenship after Yugoslavia, that deals with these issues at a legal and sort of personal level. My wife, who was born in Sarajevo, she had to renege her Bosnian Republican citizenship when this whole thing started, to get a new passport, an ID card. She was flabbergasted. She, you know, what does this mean? They said, no, you have to renege. You can't have two Republican citizenships. So there is a magma of issues that, you know, thankfully we are dealing with here, and many others before us on this issue. In terms of Europeanization that we talked about, we are very Europeanized societies at one level. I would say culturally, to speak very simply. You know, we partake in the culture of the West broadly writ. You know, whether it's the rock music or movies. You know, we think we know more about America than Americans because of the movies and the series, let alone European culture. And as I said, we travel there. The problem is obviously politics and the legacy of communism that we have. And I think the discussion between Václav Havel and Adam Michnik is a very good one on trying to discern what exactly is happening here. There's obviously so much to say, but I would like to turn to this issue of EU enlargement. I think you have all eloquently talked about that. We are between the hammer and the anvil of the fatigue, and on the other hand, the lack of enthusiasm of our leaders to pursue democratic reforms. Now, there are some objective reasons. There's definitely the legacy, which I insist on. It is very hard to kind of come out of an atomized society that communism produced, let alone the fact that we were all very rural societies until World War II, and then there was the modernization that came through communism, industrialization, etc. You know, again, Europeanized and Westernized. We had the first supermarket in Belgrade in, I think, 1954, based on the American model. You know, there were so many things that came our way through and via culture, but then politics did not follow. And Ferenc Feher wrote about this very well, about the over-politicization. Everybody had to be a member of the Communist Party or the National Front, but of course nobody was allowed to deal with politics. So this kind of schizophrenia of politics that I think Paul Ricoeur, and I'm glad Adam used them so much in his introduction. You know, he said, le mal spécifique du politique, le bien spécifique, the evil of politics and the good of politics. And what we experienced in communism was the evil of politics. There was no good. And now we're trying to kind of break through that glass ceiling. I think that the fact that we have been burdened by these crises, starting with the financial and economic crisis in 2008, then with the migration crisis, then with Russia's aggressiveness, you know, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Ukraine, etc., has steered Europe's attention to these more important priorities, and that's left an open space. And obviously then domestic politics, I think one of you mentioned, gets embroiled in our affairs. The fact that you know, Macron did what he did, which was, you know, as a French student, as a Francophile, I was completely flabbergasted and really outraged by stopping North Macedonia and Albania back in October 2019. Inadmissible. What? For domestic purposes, right? Afraid that Marine Le Pen would use this or whatever. So the domestic politics of these countries becomes part of our politics, given the stoppage or stop and go of European integration, coupled with then the fact that we have all declared that we want to join the European. Most of these countries want to join NATO as well, except Serbia, of course, and in Bosnia, we know the issue with Dodik on that question, but not much is being done on the actual reform process. Also here, the economic crisis impinged on these developments. We had growth of about 7-8% until 2009-10, when the economic crisis kicked in. What do politicians do? They try to divert attention to other issues then from the pocket, which is emptier and emptier every day. And so we're caught in this unfortunate situation. And people who have lived through the war, and we will not have war, despite, you know, loose punditry that happens all over the place, are then engaged in a process of diversion and returning to ethnic politics. You know, I'm the one who will defend you if anything else happens. Or in my country, you have this kind of fireworks of all sorts of projects, some positive things like the vaccine now, or finally we have highways that have been built. But on the other hand, this authoritarian trend, control over the media, and you name it. So I think the European Union clearly has awoken, thanks to the Americans, given what happened with the Russians and Chinese kind of doing a variety of things. The Russian spoilers, the Chinese, building their Belt and Road project and giving credits, and the lack of European, I would say, economic activity, in spite of the fact that the European Union is the biggest actor. Just one data point. Our Prime Minister, when she was in New York last year, said that Serbia exports more to Kosovo than to Russia and China and Turkey combined. These are things that people don't understand. There's a lot of loose talk about so much of this influence, which is important to note. So we are, to use the horrible cliche, we are a crossroads of civilization. All empires have passed through here, and thus these futures are totally intertwined. The fact is, what do we do about it? Or do we just procrastinate and are happy that we don't have conflict? Thanks very much.
Would you like to comment on this first round of presentations?
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Actually, in terms of diversity and potential, this first round was beyond expectations. And thank you, Ivan, for recentering the discussion around identity, mobility, and in the center, of course, democracy. And I would like to relaunch the discussion on that. I'm sure that you wish to react to each other's presentations. A short note before that to the students who are following us. So Yasmin Hasic is in charge, partially still, of an NGO in Sarajevo. You can check that out, humanityinaction.org. There is every year an international summer school, and that's a constructive way to discover another side of Europe. Now, coming back to the topic, listening to you, my impression is confirmed that the Balkans are basically Europe in small. So each and every major European question unfolds in the Balkans. So starting with memory, history, national constructions of the past, post-conflict situation, the pipe dream of the end of history, the migration issue, minority issues, ethnic and religious. So there is everything Europe needs to know about herself. And I would like to relaunch you on that, is that when the West looks into this mirror, which is one of the many distorted mirrors the West has and doesn't really like to look into, how does the future of the European construction look like when we look into this volcanic mirror?
Look, I'm sort of the Luc van Middelbar school. Europe will muddle through. I don't, the Monet method, small steps. You don't go through big triumphal gates. You go through small doors and you push forward. I don't know whether it's my age or not, but I think it has worked until now. And I think what sort of Russia or others or the US disregard, and maybe our small countries, is that Europe has found a model of how to work. It's unique, it's original. Nothing like this has ever been done before in modern times, of countries coming together, of understanding that after the catastrophes of the world wars and other, you have to find institutions that, and I use the metaphor of earthquakes, you have to build a building that will survive an earthquake of magnitude 9. And that is that when the earthquake comes, the building starts shaking, but it remains in place. I think that's what the European construct is about and remains about. When Trump won, when Brexit happened, you suddenly had a surge of popularity, of support for the European Union project in every country, because that's when people put a finger to their head and said, wait a minute, what if this thing breaks apart? You know, Yugoslavia, etc. The difference between a federation like Yugoslavia is very simple. It didn't have democracy and was communist. European Union is democratic for all intents and purposes. And there is a table that is pretty stable, and they sit around it. Even when it shakes, when they have all these differences, they all go out and find it. So I think that is why everyone wants to join. I say it very often. If we were in all our countries to have a referendum on Europe, joining Europe this Sunday, we would have majorities of people who wanted to join, very clear majorities. Just remember the situation in Croatia before the referendum on Europe. There were all these right-wing Croatians who were coming from Australia and I don't know, New Zealand, who said, no, this is horrible, this is new Moscow, whatever. Yeah, when people came out, you had a very strong majority. Likewise in Slovenia on NATO. Yeah, we can think whatever we want about NATO, but people have a common sense that it's better to be under this Western umbrella. So I steer through. I think we are, if I dare say, in the business of are very important. And all in our I with my little this, you know, it how great this project is. I always remember Obama's speech in Hanover, I think, when he came before Brexit happened. The message was, people, do you really have? Do you understand? And this begs the question of the narrative. Are we good at talking about it, or do we take it all for granted? And then a question that I often ask is, what does it mean to have lived in peace, at least in Western Europe, for 70 years? Have we lost the edge of history? That is where civic education, you know, talks. These issues of memory are so important.
Thank you, Ivan. Velibor, perhaps, do you agree on this European model that Ivan has just sketched?
I think we have a lot in common, because I would also fancy myself a Yugoslav as well. I'm a bit far removed, so maybe I'm kind of balancing the external perspective on the region and the internal one. But ultimately, I think in this case, like an institutionalist, I guess, a structuralist. I do think that these, I do think the pull is sufficient. I do think the EU will muddle through, but again, I want to emphasize that I do think that fundamentally Europe is incomplete, as the EU has said, and various other member states, without integrating the Balkans. But I do think that will come at some other institutional balancing with regards to the EU. So I think the wider it gets, I think there's going to be more of these ideas of variable geometry and sort of different configurations at the core. So I think some elements will get maybe not necessarily diluted, but maybe recalibrated. So I think those two I don't think are inseparable. But the broad question, whether or not the Western Balkans have a European perspective, whether it's going to happen, I think they will. I've always found it very, very interesting, just the whole idea of it. You know, all these countries have gone out of their way, Central and Eastern Europe and Western Balkan countries, to demonstrate that they are sovereign nation states and to demonstrate their own identity, only to then enter the European Union and possibly try to forget it and then look towards a more supranational identity. So to me, it's kind of, you have to create borders before you can take them down. It's almost like you do it on your own terms. And I think that we're still in the process of that process. So once that gets complete, I think then we will see enlargement to the Western Balkans with these other institutional side effects, if I can say, within the existing EU members.
Thank you very much. We could have a huge debate, an everlasting one, about European identity, and if it's a good idea to sketch future perspectives in identitarian terms. So now, Jovana and Yasmin, you talked about the local scale of things and grassroots initiatives and NGOs. So how would you react to this question on European perspectives? And also, what can we do to improve these local activities? So what would you expect on the regional level? What would you need from the EU, from international organizations to overcome local shortcomings and blockings, despite the positive examples Giovanna gave? So Giovanna, how to improve things and improve democracy in the context that you sketched?
I think that civil society actors needs to be brought to the decision-making table, and not just as observers, but as people having knowledge and experience that is relevant for a decision-making process. This is something that I think is not important just for Europeanization process or the process of Western Balkan countries becoming members, but it's also something that is very much needed for within European political space as such. I think the inability of official state representatives to deal with issues like climate crisis and pandemic, as you know, is showing to what extent we need voices that are outside of the classical institutional political decision-making, places and offices. I think the global climate movement is showing that that certain knowledge, awareness, ideas are not present where they really need to be within the political institutions of political representative. And I really like the metaphor that you said before, that is that the region of Western Balkans is in many ways just a mirror of the processes that are going on within the EU. And I think this is true. And in this way, giving the voice to the organizations on one level, and the other is giving space where they can be active and express themselves. So not closing the spaces of alternative voices, both physically and in symbolic sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, Yasmin, so what would you need on your local level to improve the visibility of these activities? So what can you add to that?
So the cliche answer would be more money and independence, but everybody's going to laugh at this, though everybody knows it's true. However, what we need is more research, to be very honest. I agree with what Giovanna said. I mean, we need to move from this non-participation stage of Western Balkans being tokenized, right? Invited to the table, but nobody really sort of responds or engages, or it's just an interchange of sort of opinions, to this participation stage where we need to be consulted and informed and making decisions and sharing decisions, sort of being advised and sort of give advice and However, what I feel is, in the context of the EU, to be very honest, is very important, is to have real knowledge and research that is based on not some sort of pre-assumed outcomes that often do appear. And I will just give one example. I won't name the organizations or the countries or so I will just name one research that I've read recently that I was under the impression that French population is super anti-Western Balkans. Everything I've ever read that came out of the cuisine of any French or any Western sort of researcher is that, Western Balkans is a big no-no. There's a big sort of national consensus on it. And then I read another research which was sponsored by a Central European country, which I will not name, which was a large-scale, super-duper productive and methodologically sort of sound and had all the right questions, and the results were completely different from anything that I've read. Not saying that this one research should take lead now in our shaping views about how French people think about us, but the way the questions were formed and the way the French people responded to this type of questionnaire, which was not sort of French based, was very much different to what I believe that the French society believes about our own Balkan sort of way. So this is not to criticize French researchers or anybody else, but I think there should be a mix of not only French and Westerners, let's say, doing research on how France feels about XYZ, or only Poles doing research about Polish views in the EU, but we should sort of see what can be done so that Finnish people are investigating Portugal and Portuguese people investigating whatever Britain, and so on and so forth. And then into this mixed pot of research and sort of intertwined perceptions, we should also include the Western Balkans if there's a perspective of joining there. And just to weigh in a very small comment on the future of the European Union, I have very rarely witnessed any discussion where I've been part of or listened to where anybody asks about the future of NATO, right? Like, it's a given, right? They will survive. They have this one common denominator. There's money, there's army that's always going to exist, arms, and so on and so forth. And I partially think that we're conditioned to think about the European Union's future because I think the European Union is a political organism, whereas NATO is a political organization. So the organization will survive when the organisms combining the organization die or disappear. The organization itself will exist. However, the European Union has become saturated with institutional sort of frameworks and goals and human rights and whatever. And then it's become an organism. So we have begun to sort of question ourselves whether it's going to survive or not. I think it will, but we will have to have another discussion on it, as I see on the clock. Just one small intervention on the previous question. Sorry.
Can I just add a note to what Yasmin just said? There's a very good, very recent opinion poll series done in France by Srđan Cvijić, one of our colleagues. It's published. I can share the link with you. And it shows what I think all of us know. People in Europe are not against the people of the Western Balkans coming in. They're already in the European Union. You know, the outflow of Yugoslavs in the mid-60s when Tito opened the borders, there's not a country where there aren't people from Slovenia, Croatia, etc., down to Macedonia, Kosovo, who are not in Switzerland, France, you know, you name the country. And so all of us have at least some a family member who has worked since the 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, I live in Vienna. Literally, you can hear our language on every corner, in every shop, because this is where people work. But more importantly, this is where the domestic politics of the European countries really kind of blurs and creates noise in the system. This opinion poll, and one was done in Germany 2 years ago, in the focus groups, people say, no, I don't have anything about it. The problem is with Turkey. That's really the big one, why France introduced a referendum process, etc. But and politicians, and this is where we lack leadership in Europe, to say, people, first of all, Western Balkan countries are far from membership. Let's get them on the track. This is an important question, I think, that we all are advocating here. Let's have these countries moving. We can stop them at any moment, but if we have them moving, then we are, one, credible, and we're faithful to the European project.
We also, yes, Giovanna, but we also have some questions from our audience. So, Giovanna, if you have a short call.
Yeah, I will be very short. I just wanted to underline what I think Yasmin wanted to say with his comparison of two researches. And that is that we also should challenge the asymmetry in the knowledge production about the region, where the production of knowledge and the authority and expertise is somewhere on the West, while the East or Western Balkan countries are seen as the subjects of the research, but not those having authority of making sound judgments that will be, you know, relevant for policies, everything from policy making to cultural stereotypes. So I think that also this is part of the something needed in the future to challenge this asymmetry in knowledge production.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one question coming from the audience. What is called uncivil society in other countries, the extremist nationalist groups, which also presents a pole of attraction for disaffected youth? And finally, can grassroots mobilization alone, without official involvement, actually produce change? To answer this, Yasmin?
I didn't hear the question very well. I wanted to read it, but I'm clicking on Q&A. I can't really see it. Can you repeat it, please? Sorry.
It's about what is called uncivil society in other countries, meaning the extremist nationalist groups, which also present attraction for disaffected youth. And finally, can grassroots mobilization alone, without official involvement, actually produce change?
Okay, so I'm unfamiliar with the term, but let me explain what I feel is sort of problematic in our sort of understanding what civil society does, how it's sort of positioned within the society. I think there's a micro. What I feel today, as opposed to what has been happening in the last 25 years, is that civil society in Bosnia, though it has been developing, very much what I'm going to say about Bosnia runs in all the other countries with small nuances and differences. It has been developing through externally funded, externally driven projects, people coming over, telling us, what do you need? Somebody gets a feedback, there's a money, there's a pot, you can take the money, you can do the project. Civil society compensating for what the country cannot do on its own, the institutions and so on and so forth. However, there has been a shift now. I wouldn't call it on civil society in this sense, but sort of hogged civil society. Let's put it this way. Let's coin a term together now. What I perceive now is a huge danger to the existence of civil society in our country, which is jeopardized by the huge UN and other institutions. So what is happening right now in Bosnia in the last, let's say 5 years? The international donors, unlike in the past, don't usually come to Bosnia to offer huge grants to the civil society that they want to promote for the causes that they want to advocate for, that the country is not compensated, the usual sort of business. But instead, they have sort of lost trust in the civil society here for good or bad reasons. I don't want to go into it. But what happens now is that the international donors now, pour most of the money, like huge, vast majority of the money into the UN, IOM, UNDP, whatever, you name it, and then they behave as the grant makers. They take majority of the funds for their own salaries, for their own programs, and so on and so forth, and then they give the crumbs to the civil society as a sub-grantees of the projects that they run. And this is, to me, I wouldn't say uncivil civil society, but a hogged one, a captured one. We often talk about captured states in the Western Balkans, but nobody's addressing this issue. How come nobody trusts civil society anymore, and we need this supervisor in the terms of UN bodies that takes all the money and then decides what the sub-grantees will do in this country? I don't think this is a way to move forward. I don't have a way to resolve this. I'm not powerful enough, obviously, to go up against the UN and tell them, back off, we need this money and things need to be done in this way. But this is what's happening. And I think the civil society eventually, by becoming sub-grant, and the sub-grantees are obviously, and you can presume what I'm about to say, are not given money on a merit base. It's usually, unfortunately, done on dinners and some soirees and so on and so forth. So the civil society as such, especially in the marginalized communities outside of the capital, are dying out. So I don't think this is a good idea. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but this is the trend happening in Bosnia, and I would very much advocate if anybody could sit at the table and sort of challenge this perspective, because this is not the right way to move forward.
There's also the brain drain phenomenon and problem in the region, which is also kind of problematic, right?
Absolutely. This drives people away because the insecurity they feel in the public by not receiving what they need from the institutions that we pay money to protect, are not also received through the civil society. People are absolutely, I call them, okay. So there is a diaspora that is constant generated. I call this type of people suspense generated diaspora. So the young people leaving Bosnia because their life is always and constantly in suspense. What do I mean by suspense? If you're a young person in Bosnia, you cannot get married unless you have certain money or certain apartment because you're stepping into an insecurity. Before you get married, you need a job, therefore. If you have a job and you get married, for instance, then you need additional your spouse to have a job because you can't start a family. And then when you get a first child, so all the things are building up in a certain way that are normally perceived outside. Here, everybody is in suspense. Your next chapter of life cannot begin unless the previous one is resolved. And this is the suspense that is built among young people who want to leave the country as soon as possible because they cannot plan their lives. And as soon as they leave the country, they go abroad and they jumpstart and get all stages and all chapters in their life as soon as possible instead of waiting for the right opportunity in Bosnia. And this is terrible, terrible thing that I think we will not be able to reverse on our
own. One last question for you. You're very popular, Yasmin. From the audience, coming from the audience, there were many attempts to build a narrative around a nation building narrative, but all this failed. So how would you envision such a common Bosnian memory around what elements of tropes?
I realize everybody on this conversation, everybody following this discussion, every person ever engaging with Bosnia in any way could understand that the memory could not build among common denominators. What happened, who did what, and how do we move forward with the information that we agreed on, because we will never agree on. As I said at the very beginning, I think the memory in this country should be built around principles that are commonly agreed, that should not be challenged, even though the principles themselves hurt one of the narratives or the memories. So building a future on a memory doesn't exist, but building a future on a principle that supports a certain narrative of memory could work. So if we all agree that genocide is bad, as I said very beginning, pretty much every nation in the Western Balkans have gone through some sort of victimhood that related genocide or massacres and so on and so forth. If we agree on this, then we should just say there is absolutely agreement on genocide being a bad thing and use co-against something that nobody is up for, that everybody should condemn, and sit together and build a set of laws, set of measures and so on and so forth to do it. But then you enter into very dangerous politics of abuse of memory based on the principles that you do. And this is the problematic part. So if we could just jumpstart some sort of common agreement on the principles rather than on the subjects that we want to discuss, I think this would be a way to move forward, and then the future would show us whether we were right or not. In this case, I don't think any other option is available as possible in this country, let alone in the region.
Okay, time is running short actually, but I have another question which I found very interesting. Coming from the audience, I work at the University of Teacher Education in Zurich, and we are involved in teacher training in the region, competencies for democracy, responsive schools, etc. Suggestions for us. Giovanna, I think this is for you. It has to do with civic citizenship issues.
I just didn't understand the part after teacher trainings in the region. What was the last sentence?
It was competences for democracy, responsive schools. Do you have any suggestion for a education center in Zurich in trying to be more involved in the region?
Thank you. Yes, I do. Very practical. Actually, I was personally involved as a sort of trainer or a workshop leader, yeah, for history teachers from different former countries of former Yugoslavia, and it was on multi-perspectivity in history teaching. And I can share three conclusions from that, which I think could be reused for other projects. First is that more than anything, people are the teachers themselves are grateful for the opportunity to meet each other cross borders. For any kind of this activity, I think it's very important to understand that that people are lacking and wanting even more contacts. So not just official Belgrade and official Zagreb, but teachers from suburbs of smaller towns in Serbia meeting teachers from likewise small communities in Bosnia. Second was the training that I was leading. It was dealing with multi-perspectivity in history teaching, and I was surprised to what extent professors were aware of or the teachers were aware that this kind of teaching is needed. Multi-perspectivity in history teaching means that you challenge the underlying assumption that the main lens of memory or historical narrative is the national one. And you are introducing not only more voices to the historical interpretations, you step outside of the idea that there is one objective historical memory, but also you're introducing not only nations as the agents of memory, but you're introducing voices such as, how certain historical events looked from a female perspective or from a perspective of blue-collar worker or an intellectual elite. I think all these perspectives are important, and they are challenging by definition to the dominant and identity and memory politics. So I think that along these principles, things should be done even more further. Because so it's also important, I think, when we are talking about identity in memory in historical context in the region, I think it's very important not only to teach people, to present them the option that these are not fixed, but rather constructed social concepts and constructs. And just the way that they were constructed, they could be deconstructed and new ones could be created. But not only to teach them, but also rather to give them tools and then let them be free to invent their own or to create new alternative narratives and a new memory communities that would be, that would be imagined outside this ethno-national dominant frame of thinking.
Maria, if I can just add 2 words on this, because I believe it's not only on the same topic, but the same project. There's been very important work done in what's called the Joint History Project that was run out of the Thessaloniki Center for Democracy and Reconciliation in Southeastern Europe, funded by a number of donors that brought historians from the whole region together and trainings for secondary school history teachers. The initial work was to plow through all the history books of secondary schools in all of these countries. The product were teaching tools, as Joanna says, on a number of issues: First World War, Second World War, the Ottoman legacy. That was the result of this joint history effort. And these books have been translated into all the languages, including Greek and Turkish. And they have been used in schools with the assent of most of the ministries of education. This work goes back 15, if not 20 years. There have been efforts by the German foundation, the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, that brought Serbian and Croatian historians together. Again, there are so many things that don't meet the eye of kind of in this simplistic world of the 24-hour news cycle. There's been really a work of kind of, people have rolled back their sleeves and done this. And so there's a lot to base on to move this forward. But clearly, what is one of the lessons is that we need to teach this history in these diverse ways to, keep repeating never again, to give students and the general population what really happened, no matter whether people agree or not, but this has to be known. I think that was one of the problems of former Yugoslavia, that it tried to sweep under the carpet a lot of the things that had happened in history.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this. 2-3 minutes left. What is the main message that you would like the audience to take away? Each of you. We start with Adam. 2-3 seconds you have.
Well, in short, when I highlight the diversity and the potential of the Balkans, I'm often called a dreamer. And I take it as a compliment. I think that to sketch future perspectives for Europe, we need more dreams. We need good quality fiction. The problem is not with dreaming, the problem is with bad quality fiction. So fake news, conspiracy theories, and xenophobic narratives. So yes, let's try to, dream together, because in these two regions that we examined, there are many places that don't dream, or that don't dream anymore, that still have nightmares, or that have foolish dreams about an idealized image of Europe. So the problem is not with dreaming, the challenge is to dream together to sketch new perspectives. And I think that this webinar points in this direction. Thank you.
Joanna?
I would say let's challenge the knowledge production that is still dominant, in which voices from the region are marginal. We hear a lot of narratives about the region, but I would like to invite everybody to follow and read more voices coming precisely from the region, and challenging also the underlying assumptions beneath the dominant knowledge production. I think this is what would be my message to students. Thank you.
Yasmin?
Again, cliche, stay in school, but that's the funny part. I guess what I would say, and what we say to our fellows in Humanity in Action, is you're never too young to be a leader and never too old to be an activist. So I think this is something that everybody should take into their own brains and cognitive sort of memory, and think about this sentence all the time when they want to do something. I think that there are no national sort of visions, there are no transnational visions, there are only localized sort of perspectives of what you can do as a person. Just start there and see where it takes you. So I think this is going to be my message.
Yeah, very, very in line with what everybody else has been saying, just to keep the discussions going. I think it's great that, if I can say so on behalf of us here, to organize this kind of discussion where we have 4 panelists that have roots in the region, with a discussant and a moderator that are from Southern Europe, Central Europe. And I think by having these kind of discussions, I think we can start challenging these underlying assumptions, and to help us dream and to help us be a little bit more ambitious. So I think just having to keep the discussion going is very important. It might be taken for granted, but I think it's important.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
Yeah. Thanks. Again, absolutely agreeing with all of the colleagues here. We need to dream, and we need to act on our dreams. And we need to remind ourselves every day that democracy was not served on a silver plate. It was won in the streets of Europe and institutions and the United States, and many people died for the right to vote, for the freedom of speech and assembly. We were just reminded the other day that Switzerland got the women's vote only 50 years ago. My goodness, incredible. So that is what we need to do. And democracy is really after the elections and before the famous 4 years. Yeah, the elections are important. We need to partake, create the necessary conditions, but it's really the daily job of reinventing democracy, with ourselves as individuals, in our families, in our neighborhood, and then up to the state level, and to keep the pressure on our leaders if they're not doing right. That's the only way. And so creating the space of freedom and fighting for our freedom remains a perennial even today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, our panelists, our audience. Thank you very much for this very rich discussion. I don't know, keep following our center's activities and webinars, and take good care and have a nice day. Thank you so much a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maria.